Welcome, everybody, and sorry that I can't see all of you with this presentation. And I would like to talk about what happens to our voice as citizens, as users, and I will talk about it from a participation point of view, but also from representation point of view, from what happened to our politicians. And then we'll try to see whether social networks and the power dynamics actually change this voice that we are supposed to have on social networks. So I'll start actually with what happened to our participation on social networks. And I'll start by saying that, first of all, neutrality and equality are the exception on social networks and not the frequent state, which is something that we don't think about. And we can see it in different ways in terms of empirical, I would say, evidence. So the first evidence for non-equality that exists on social networks of our voice is what we call the power law. The idea that a small number of actors, social actors, attract most of the attention of us, the users. And the best way to show it is actually on the social networks map. For example, look at that map. It's this from January 21 now. And you can see that, in fact, Facebook, in this case, actually captures the attention of most of the world. And in fact, also Instagram, that belongs to Facebook as well. We see the power law. It exists also almost on every topic that we will see on social networks, on search engines, on browsers, on the way we interact on social networks. So the idea that we have small number of actors that attract most of the usage and attraction and attention of people. And the second thing that happens that shows that equality and neutrality are the exception on social networks is that we see a tendency to have homophily, the idea where we kind of interact with people that resemble us or that like content which aligns with socio-demographic alignments to what we are used to. And homophily, if you can see the upper diagram, we can see that when we talk about politics, usually Democrats or my camp or your camp would be talking only to itself and not talking cross each other. And this comes with another tendency of polarization. The Pew Internet Center has been testing that since 1994. And take a look at what happens to the blue line in the middle, which means this is the part where I can be a Democrat, I can be a Republican, we can not agree to each other, but we can still talk to each other. And this is going smaller and smaller. So the blue line in the middle is shrinking more and more. Take a look at what happened in 2017. Unfortunately, we don't have the 2020 kind of diagram. But what I want to see is this happens not only in America, it happens also in other liberal democracies. We have less tendency and less shared content that we agree upon. And democracies built on this shared content and values that we can depend on. So if this is shrinking, then we have a problem to continue this way. And the participation obviously becomes unstable. Adding to all this, we have the idea that false news, fake news, if you'd like, tend to spread much faster to a larger audience and to more, I would say, different types of audiences. So, for example, if you see here, this is the vaccination discussions on networks, and the red dots are fake accounts. And you see how many of them, without even needing to model this mathematically, you can see that the idea that fake accounts and fake news itself, content, exist almost in every topic that we discuss. So what does that mean to our voice in terms of democracy? Is it really our authentic voice, or is it voices of, I would say, power nodes and power actors that have interest in actually manipulating the public sphere? To this, we have to ask ourselves not only what happened to participation, but what happens to our voice in terms of representations. Who are the politicians that represents us today in social networks? And that has also changed. So if before we got used to the fact that in every democracy we have balances, we have checks and balances, we are seeing it more and more in different democratic regimes that we see more what we call personal politics. So we see the leaders and not the party. And not only personal politics, we see more and more populist personal politics. And what actually identifies the populist voices of leaders is the idea that they talk in 5 different categories. I'll give only some of them. The idea of us versus them. They, the elites, the communicative elites, the judicial elites, the interrogation elites, they are against us, and we represent you. You're the people, we represent you. And we see that very strongly, and where the social networks have strengthened the idea where those kinds of leaders circumvent the traditional gatekeepers. For example, if you'd like it, mass communication. And they talk directly to the people. And we saw it in the Capitol Hill last week when Trump was giving the big speech of his supporters to go to the Capitol Hill and enter to the Capitol Hill. So we see it a lot. For example, the rigged and corrupt media is the enemy of the people. It's a very populist kind of message. So our representation of our politicians became very personal. And also the way that we conceive, the way that we treat reality and the discussion and power dynamics on social networks have totally changed. If you take a look at that, this is Hillary Clinton's agenda at the time of her campaign. What captured her campaign was the email scandal. Now, obviously, the email scandal was not that important as, for example, issues like education, like health, but it did capture, you can see, the whole campaign. And it happened because there were power actors that had an interest to put it in front. And so what I want to say is that today the representation is very skewed. It doesn't really represent the real power dynamics in societies, but it represents a kind of a skewed and biased dynamic where marginal groups have more power. So, for example, if you look at that picture, this is a kind of a diagram of what's going on in the German politics a year ago, where the AfD, it's their alt-right party in Germany, captures around 85% of the traffic, of the political traffic, where in reality it is around 11 to 15%. So we see that distortion again and again when we come to representation, and we see sometimes fake accounts like the one you see in front of you, Tennessee GOP, which is supposed to represent the Republican Party, but in fact it was created by the Russian, and it took a few years until this account was deleted by Twitter. So when we're talking about participation and representation, we have to understand that it's very skewed and that there are biases. And what we see in social networks doesn't necessarily reflect the real social dynamics and power dynamics that are happening between actors. To the story enters the intermediaries, the bigger platforms, Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, etc. Today, politics is not being done only in the physical space, of course, but also on the social networks. I would say mostly on social networks, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. And they have the power to actually, I would say, channel the flows of information, and each one in their own space, but channel their information as their interest, as they would like. And what we know is that the big platform, they actually act as if they were governments in social networks. So the government are very powerless when it comes to social networks. And what happens is that the big platforms decide for us what we'll say, when we'll say, how we'll say, who will be able to interact with us. They are actually governments. They legislate, they decide the rules, they enforce those rules, and in fact, they become also the judge if you try to appeal to something. But obviously, so for example, this is an example of anti-Semitic group that was banned from Facebook. Other groups were not banned from Facebook. Why? We don't know. It's very untransparent. And in fact, the idea that one private company decides what will be said and what will not be said, and with a lot of impact to the political discourse, is very troubling. And we saw that also with the Capitol Hill story, and after the election in the United States, where Facebook and Twitter decided to ban Trump. What's interesting about this is that all those platforms have been very careful not to touch fake news until recently. If you see that, Facebook deletes fake accounts, a lot of them, around 2 billion, which is almost the number of its users every 3 months. But they didn't touch the idea of fake news. So we have to differentiate between fake accounts and fake content until COVID-19 pandemic, where they started to really delete also content of fake news, and until the election of the United States, where they not only put a fact checker, but they also deleted news and content. This is something very new. Into this thing, we have to understand that intermediaries also change the way that we allocate, I would say, different resources. For example, artificial intelligence that decides for us whether we'll get a job, whether we get our social security, whether we are risky and we are supposed to be in jail or not in jail. All those intermediaries are technologies that are taking values in societies and in fact helps decision maker to make the decision. But what happens is that in fact they replace the decision makers. The intermediaries that in fact substitute the real government, we get a situation where democracies are becoming more and more challenged. Their checks and balances are not enough in order to make sure that they are in a very stable stage. Enter into all this comes the idea of virality. And virality is this idea that information flows very fast to many audiences, to very varied audiences, and it has the power, when we're talking about political virality, not entertainment virality, it has the power to change reality. It has the power to create kind of demand from governments to be more accountable. And we saw it in different examples. I'll give only 3. One example is the Me Too. The Me Too kind of revolution that happened in many countries had a big impact, not only legally, but also from a cultural point of view. So this is a very nice aesthetic social network analysis of my colleague Erin Gallagher that shows how the information flowed in the first 24 hours to 84 countries and millions of people. And only from one tweet of Elisa Milano, if you've looked and felt something like that, then you probably have to say Me Too. And we saw the Me Too also repercussion and other types of things in many other countries. You probably know it from Chile. We came the song and the dance of Rapist in Your Path. I'll show a part of it. Can you click on the... So it's very interesting. So what we see is that suddenly you have information flows that become viral, that change all the power dynamics that we've been talking about before, that anyway were skewed, right? We talked about it in the participation and representation. A picture like that probably would have gone through without noise can actually burn America. You know, a picture where you see that policeman that basically killed George Floyd, where you start a whole kind of a viral events against it, which uprise and create social movements of Black Lives Matter and collective action against the government in America. So you have this virality that changes really the rules of the game. So I want to kind of recap some of the things that I've said. So first of all, what I want to say is that we have to understand that information flows are not neutral. They're very political. The technology itself is political because the people who design the technology are designing it in kind of interest that they have. Obviously, users can use it differently, but those are power struggles that are happening. And when you take this into consideration, that also our freedoms are bounded by private entities like Facebook, like Google, like other big companies, you know, the checks and balances of democracy becomes very fragile. And we have to ask ourselves, who takes in charge, and what are the red lines that we have to say, okay, in this case, we're regulating that. In this case, we're not regulating that. So very interesting times that we are occurring, and we have to be very in attention to what happens to our democracies. Thank you very much.